Dr. Mather, thank you for agreeing to do this video interview. You've just been awarded the 2023 Samuel Torrey Orton Award, which is the International Dyslexia Association's highest honor. And it recognizes you for your contributions to dyslexia research and dyslexia awareness, and to helping everybody get better at treating and identifying this condition. So first, I just want to say congratulations. We are all so happy to see you celebrated in this way.
Well, thank you very much. It's really quite an honor. So I really appreciate it. And as I say, it's quite an honor.
Can you talk a little bit about your why? What motivated you and what has kept you intrigued with this field of study?
I think what motivated me was when I started out, I got a master's degree in behavior disorders, and went into a middle school, with kids who'd been classified at that time as emotionally handicapped. And one of the things I really realized is a lot of the reason that these kids were so disenfranchised, upset, was they were having trouble reading. They couldn't read. So they couldn't keep up with their classmates. They felt angry. They hated school. And I thought, this is really a huge problem, and we need to get these kids when they're kindergarten, first grade. And so we don't end up with students again who feel essentially so left out and that they can't fully participate. So that sort of started my journey, really, in terms of interest of, we really need to help children learn how to read at a young age.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So a lot's changed in how we approach dyslexia. I wonder what you notice is different about how we approach this condition today versus when you started.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I don't think a lot has actually changed in terms of the approach to intervention. I think what has changed is there's much more awareness now, better teacher training, just, greater involvement. There's parent groups like Decoding Dyslexia that now I think every state has a chapter, of just, again, parents advocating for their children in school. And so I just think, there's a lot, more awareness. If we look back historically, back into the 1920s, 1930s, we'll really see they knew a lot, even back then, about how to help students with dyslexia. And so I think there's been a lot known about approach to intervention and things like that. But as I say, I think the best thing that's happening right now is just the increased awareness and the increased amount of teacher training. And so more attention and deeper understanding, of dyslexia.
Right. You made a big contribution yourself to increasing that awareness and training teachers in what to look for. And now you have authored, you're one of the authors of a new assessment, the Tests of Dyslexia. I wonder if you talk a little bit about that process. What were your goals in creating that test, and what's that process been like working with WPS to bring that test to market?
Well, it's probably been about 8 years ago at this point in time, but there's just one day I started thinking, why is it that I have to go to 3 or 4 or 5 different tests in order to do a comprehensive evaluation of dyslexia? It's just, why isn't it all in one place? And so that most of the things that I'd want to administer are in one battery, rather than, again, having to go to different tests that have different norms, different age ranges, et cetera. And so it was just thinking again, we need to put this all in, one place. And so anyway, so, we got started. I've worked with Barbara Wendling for a long time, and Steve and Sherry McCallum and Bell. And they've actually had an article back in Journal of Learning Disabilities, I think in 2006, maybe, about creating a test of dyslexia. So again, I talked to them and we just talked about, well, what should be included in such a test? And so, one thing, of course, you want your quantitative information, from your tests and things like that. So your kind of different kinds of tests. You want to look at the linguistic risk factors. You want to look at reading and spelling skills. Also want to look at areas like vocabulary and reasoning that might not be, that aren't typically affected, by dyslexia. And so again, looking at that, then also thinking of we should co-norm this with rating scales. So you would also have some qualitative information from parents and teachers, and even self in terms of, the older students explaining, their perceptions, of dyslexia. And then the final thing we wanted to do too was create a bank of interventions, so that when people write reports and things and, they see, gee, there's, a weakness in blending and segmenting, they could just look and see, oh, I like that recommendation and that recommendation. And so to then make sure that the assessment results in, lead to a targeted intervention, for the student.
That is, it's an amazing test battery. I've looked in depth at it and I'm just blown away every time I look at it, and the depth of the interventions and the breadth of everything. One of the things that I find so moving about this test is, and I know you've talked about this in other places, is the efforts that you went to make sure that the test would be equitable for a wide variety of students from lots of different kinds of backgrounds. Can you talk about that, the process of making that test valid for as large a group of people as possible?
Well, I mean, one of our goals too was to have a wide age range from, kindergarten, through adult. There's still post-secondary students and adults, who've never been identified, and so trying to also take the test down as low as we could, so that there would be tests in there that you could use as predictors of risk, for younger children. We tried to be sensitive just in terms of items that were culturally fair and, that kind of, thing as well. But our main goal, again, was to have that age range, so it really could be used with an individual with dyslexia of any age.
That's a marvelous feature of that those tests. We've gotten a few questions from families, and one of the questions is about RAN, rapid automatized naming. And I'm wondering if you can speak to whether there are some skills that are more resistant to intervention than others. Do some skills take longer to remediate than others?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and one thing we do know from, quite a bit of research, that it's really easier to remediate accuracy than fluency. So the fluency is much harder to establish, and getting that automaticity. And so, we see with most adults with dyslexia, they're still slow readers. I mean, they may read accurately, but, they're still slow. And so, again, that's why it's critical. People with dyslexia get extended time on exams and things like that, so they can demonstrate, their knowledge. But in terms of RAN is a good predictor in terms of reading fluency and reading speed. So typically when a student's low on RAN tests, you'll see that their reading rate, is also slow. And I know at times people ask questions about, well, how do I fix RAN? And you don't really. RAN is a predictor. But what you want to fix and work on is reading rate, automaticity, speed of reading. So RAN is a good predictor, but it's not something you would train or try to make faster. It's just a good predictor of problems in reading fluency.
I understand. So a lot of kids in public schools who are receiving interventions for dyslexia, they may see somebody a couple of times a week for 30 minutes. If that, everyone's caseloads are really overburdened at the moment, and so resources are stretched thin. In an ideal setting, how much and what kinds of interventions would be really useful for remediating and helping those kids?
Well, in an ideal setting, each child would get an hour of one-to-one instruction from a highly trained reading teacher 5 days a week. But as you mentioned, with caseloads and things, that's often, not possible. And that's sometimes why parents, again, have to go to outside tutors and things like that to get, more support. But ideally, you would have that, consistency. And when you see kids that get that kind of intervention, they're doing very well. They still have dyslexia. They still probably aren't great spellers and still may read a little slowly, but they're accurate readers, etc. So ideally, again, we'd be able to devote that much time, to each student.
That sounds like a dream at this moment. It'd be lovely if that could happen, but I'm not sure it's possible. What do you wish people knew about dyslexia? What would you like everyone to be aware of?
The first thing is that dyslexia is real. And you'll sometimes hear people say, well, I don't know what dyslexia is, or, you should meet as a team and figure out what dyslexia, what you're going to think dyslexia is. I mean, we have a pretty clear understanding, of dyslexia. It is real. And so people should also know about the importance of earlier intervention, that, the sooner we can intervene with children who are struggling with reading, the better. It's important to understand, too, that dyslexia affects self-esteem, and motivation. And so the longer a child goes on struggling without the right kind of intervention, the greater we see problems in terms of low self-esteem and frustration and, a lack of motivation. So, again, that kind of speaks to the need for early, systematic intervention, with students. I think, again, people need to know that intervention does work. It does work. And so it's worth the effort, and the kids, do get better.
I think we're all hoping that the tests of dyslexia will help with some of that early identification and early intervention for people. There's a big groundswell of information about the science of reading, and people are moving toward structured literacy and away from some of the older approaches that maybe weren't as based in evidence. What is different now about the way instruction happens for all students, including students with dyslexia?
We know with students with dyslexia that they need systematic, sequential, intensive, typically which starts out with code-based instruction, followed then by structural analysis, teaching them how to break words into syllables, working, on fluency, etc. But, it's interesting that been in this field so long, and it just seems like, this whole concept of the reading wars, it just doesn't go away, where it's, this approach versus this approach. And, really, there's not really right or wrong approaches. It depends on the students. But with students with dyslexia, they really need systematic, instruction. We have some children that learn to read fairly easily. You'll talk to the mom and she'll say, she was 4 years old. She just took off and started reading, and you just think, you don't know how lucky you are, but we have some children that learn to read very easily. And but our children with dyslexia don't. And so, that's why they need highly trained teachers who really are knowledgeable about language structure, who can just really teach them how the system, works. But, all children don't necessarily need that, because we do have some children that they intuit it just by being exposed to reading and writing. It doesn't need to be that intensive. So it's really more about, fitting the method, to the student, whether they're being right or wrong techniques. It really kind of depends on the student and their level of development.
And it's a challenge too. I was 7th grade ELA for a long time, and it's a challenge when you get a child in the 7th grade or the 6th grade, and you think they should know how to read by now, and they don't. So
Right.
you can see that the struggle is happening, and to motivate a child like that in those circumstances, how do you do it? How do you teach what looks like kindergarten reading skills to a kid in the 7th grade who is embarrassed not to know any more than he does? What are your thoughts?
I think one thing we always have to remember is that every child, student wants to learn to read and wants to know how to read, and by the time you get middle school students, they've got a lot of, masks put on, essentially. But my experience has always been, when you get them in a one-to-one situation, you really explain how you're going to help them. You explain what dyslexia is. You explain it's harder for them to learn to read than others, but this is what we're going to do. That they become engaged and excited, about it. And so I think if we always remember, all children want to learn to read. And even if they act like they don't, that's because of the years of frustration and just feeling like, this is too hard for me. And why is it so easy for everyone else, But my experience has always been, once you start working with students, they trust you, that they're really willing to work, because everybody wants to learn to read at any age.
So we are facing record teacher shortages in classrooms all over the place, and record teacher sort of burnout and toxicity of cultures. And I wonder if you could say anything just broadly to educators, especially those who are working in very intensive fields like dyslexia intervention and reading specialists, and those folks who are in the trenches still day to day after a long career as an educator and a diagnostician, and then an educator of educators. What would you say to people who are in the classroom today in the circumstances that people are facing?
That's it's not an easy question really, but I think people who work in this field, the outcomes are so rewarding. When you really see you can teach a child how to read, and you see the difference it makes, in that child's life, and even in terms of the parents and things like that. And so, I think it's very sort of reinforcing in terms of how you're helping, and how you're helping students. And so I think, with a lot of people, that's why they do keep their passion about teaching, because they really see the difference that they're making, in lives. And so just hoping again that, people can find that passion, even if, circumstances, aren't ideal. And, always kind of think of ways, well, how can we make this work when we have so many kids? What can we do to make this work? But so I think just trying to keep, the hope and the passion, alive.
It's a difficult task, but so is learning to read.
One other thing that we need to keep in mind in terms of dyslexia evaluations is the importance of finding out about family history. Dyslexia runs in families, and if both parents have dyslexia, you have a very high chance of having dyslexia. And so we always want to ask the question in evaluations, has anyone in the family had trouble reading? Sometimes we'll see that they say, well, yeah, but the person was never diagnosed. They're older, and but doesn't like my grandpa. He doesn't like to read. He's got a lot of books, but he never reads. But so we always nearly often find a family history. The other thing too is, early speech and language difficulties, because oftentimes again, that turns in, or pretty soon there's, reading, problems as well. And then just also appreciating that dyslexia has high comorbidity or coexists with so many other disorders that, it gets complicated sometimes in terms of, evaluations when you've got a student with dyslexia and a developmental language disorder, or with dyslexia and ADHD, or with dyslexia and a math disorder. And so it can become, and then you add in like English is your second language. And, so, it can become very complicated in terms of, evaluating for dyslexia.
Mm-hmm. When you do have a student whose first language isn't English, what are some extra steps that you can take? How could you broaden the evaluation to make sure that you're able to distinguish between a language difference and a language delay and a learning disability or disorder?
I mean, in cases like that too, it's where you really need bilingual diagnosticians. You need somebody who speaks the first language of the student and also speaks English to really understand, is this just a problem reading English, or was there a problem reading Spanish as well? And so you really need somebody who is fluent, in both languages to really sort of answer those questions. In some of our languages, like Spanish, they have much more regularity between the sounds and the symbols. And so it's easier to learn to read in Spanish than it is in English, So we also have to think of the complexity of the orthography of the other language in terms of, is this a harder language, easier language to learn? So.
One thing I really love about the manual for the tests of dyslexia is that you go into all of those distinctions and ways to interpret and factors to include and consider as you're giving the test, and also as you're interpreting scores and planning interventions.